9 years ago, a young girl vanished without a trace after school, until a routine renovation by her neighbor uncovered a hidden basement that would finally unravel the dark mystery and change everything forever. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Maplewood. It was a typical spring afternoon, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. 12-year-old Anna Thompson was making her way home from school, her steps light and carefree. She hummed softly to herself, her backpack bouncing gently against her shoulders as she skipped along the familiar route. Anna was known around town as the bright, cheerful girl with a curious mind and a quick smile. Everyone in Maplewood adored her, from the friendly old librarian who saved books just for her to the crossing guard who never failed to compliment her colorful outfits. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened. That's why, when Anna didn't come home that evening, it didn't take long for worry to set in. Her mother, Lisa, had dinner ready and was setting the table when she glanced at the clock, puzzled. Anna was never late. She always called if she decided to stop by a friend's house or the park. Mark, Anna's father, arrived home from work a few minutes later, sensing Lisa's unease immediately. "Isn't she back yet?" he asked, a hint of concern creeping into his voice. Lisa shook her head, dialing Anna's friends one by one, but none of them had seen her since school let out. Panic began to build, a knot tightening in Lisa's stomach as she dialed the police. The town's small police department sprang into action, combing the streets with flashlights and calling out her name. Neighbors joined in, their faces etched with worry. They searched the parks, the alleys, even the old train tracks on the outskirts of town. They found her backpack abandoned on the sidewalk, one of the straps slightly torn as if caught on something, but no other sign of the young girl. As dawn broke the next morning, the grim reality settled in. Anna Thompson had vanished without a trace. The once lively town of Maplewood felt suffocated by fear and uncertainty. Mark and Lisa clung to each other, refusing to leave their house in case Anna somehow found her way home. The police followed every lead, interviewing classmates, neighbors, and even distant relatives. They combed through surveillance footage from local stores and gas stations, but there was nothing, no trace of Anna walking down the road, no suspicious vehicles trailing behind her. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. The media caught wind of the story, and soon reporters were flocking to the sleepy town, cameras flashing and microphones shoved into people's faces. Mark and Lisa made tearful pleas on television, begging for any information, but the weeks stretched into months, and the leads dried up. The town's hopeful whispers turned to resigned silence. Despite the community's unwavering support, the reality was suffocating. Maplewood was never the same after that. Parents tightened their grip on their children's hands, watching anxiously as school buses rolled in. The once carefree streets now held an air of caution, and every stranger was eyed with suspicion. Lisa spent her days poring over Anna's childhood photos, tracing the outlines of her smile with trembling fingers. Mark tried to keep busy, fixing anything around the house that seemed even slightly out of order, as if putting things right on the outside could somehow mend what was broken within. No one could have predicted that it would take 9 long years for the truth to finally surface, and that it would come from the house right next door. The months that followed Anna's disappearance blurred into a grim cycle of uncertainty and anguish for the Thompson family. Mark and Lisa barely spoke anymore, each lost in their own world of grief. The house that once echoed with laughter and bedtime stories now felt like a hollow shell. Lisa couldn't bear to change anything in Anna's room. The bed remained neatly made, stuffed animals arranged just as Anna had left them. Sometimes, in the early morning light, Lisa would sit on the bed and imagine Anna walking through the door, her hair windswept and cheeks flushed, laughing about some schoolyard adventure. Mark, on the other hand, threw himself into work, staying late at the office or volunteering for every extra shift. Anything to avoid coming home to the silence. When he did come back, he would sit at the dining table long after Lisa had gone to bed, nursing a cold cup of coffee and staring at the family photo on the wall, the one where Anna was grinning, missing her front teeth, her arms wrapped around his neck. People stopped visiting after a while. Friends and neighbors who had once brought casseroles and offered comforting words no longer knew what to say. It was as if the collective pain was too heavy to bear, and so they kept their distance, giving the Thompsons space to grieve alone. Lisa never stopped hoping. Every time the phone rang, she'd rush to pick it up, praying for good news. She kept Anna's name in the papers, posted on community boards, and joined online groups dedicated to finding missing children. Mark tried to be supportive, but he couldn't handle seeing Lisa crumble every time a new lead turned out to be a dead end. Their relationship, once strong and rooted in love, was now strained and fragile. They argued over small things. Mark's long hours, Lisa's obsession with following every news sighting that turned out to be nothing. Yet underneath it all, they both knew the real reason for the tension, the gaping hole that Anna had left in their lives. One evening, Lisa found herself standing outside Anna's room, unable to open the door. Mark approached, hesitated, then wrapped his arms around her. They stayed that way for a long time, saying nothing, just holding on. In that quiet moment, they both understood they couldn't continue living like this. They needed closure, or at least a way to keep moving forward, even if the pain never truly faded. The years went on, and though the ache never left, they learned to live with it. The town eventually moved on, but for Mark and Lisa, every day was a reminder of what was lost. They couldn't have known that the answers they sought were right next door, waiting to be uncovered by two unsuspecting strangers. As the years slipped by, the town of Maplewood began to heal, though the scar of Anna's disappearance never truly faded. The Thompson house, once alive with warmth and laughter, now stood as a somber reminder of loss. Lisa and Mark continued their quiet, disconnected existence, bound together by a shared grief they could never fully express. For the police, Anna's case had grown as cold as the forgotten leaves that blew through the empty streets each autumn. Initial leads had long since dried up, and the officers who had once knocked on doors and combed through every inch of the neighborhood had moved on to newer, more pressing cases. The thick stack of files that documented every desperate phone call, every tear-streaked plea, and every false sighting now collected dust in the corner of the police station's basement. Lisa clung to the hope that Anna was still alive, her mother's instinct refusing to accept any other possibility. She kept her daughter's face in the public eye, joining online forums for parents of missing children, sharing Anna's photo on every anniversary of her disappearance. Mark, though more resigned, still hoped for a miracle, but he kept his feelings buried, his grief wrapped in layers of quiet endurance. They no longer put up Christmas lights or carved pumpkins for Halloween. Birthday celebrations came and went in silence, marked only by the flicker of a single candle that Lisa would light in front of Anna's school picture. She whispered birthday wishes into the void, her words lost in the emptiness of their once joyful home. Neighbors grew uncomfortable in their presence, avoiding eye contact when they passed each other in the grocery store or at the gas station. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was just too painful, a wound that wouldn't close. The community had rallied around the Thompsons in the beginning, organizing search parties, holding candlelight vigils, and hanging missing posters in every shop window. But as the years dragged on, hope faded, and the once close-knit town slowly distanced itself from the ever-present shadow of the tragedy. Lisa became a ghost of her former self, her once bright eyes now dull and ringed with the dark circles of sleepless nights. She spent hours staring at Anna's school photo, tracing the outlines of her daughter's smile with trembling fingers. The room across the hall, still filled with colorful posters, neatly made bedsheets, and stuffed animals, remained a silent monument to a life interrupted. Mark, meanwhile, turned to routine for comfort. He mowed the lawn twice a week, even when the grass didn't need cutting. He painted the fence every spring and scrubbed the driveway until it gleamed. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering to the dark places it often went at night. Though their love had once been a source of strength, it had become strained, stretched thin by the weight of endless, unanswered questions. They moved through their days like shadows, their voices quiet, their laughter long forgotten. Friends had stopped calling, and the family gatherings that once filled their weekends had ceased entirely. But even as the world around them moved on, Lisa refused to let go. She kept Anna's bedroom door closed, the air within still faintly scented with the strawberry shampoo her daughter had loved. She clung to every memory, every scrap of evidence, every faded photograph, determined not to let the world forget her little girl. And then, Just as the last glimmers of hope seemed ready to fade completely, the winds of fate began to stir. Change was coming to Maplewood, carried in on the backs of two strangers who had no idea the storm they were about to unleash. 9 years after Anna's disappearance, the house next door to the Thompsons was finally sold. It had sat empty for years, its peeling paint and overgrown yard a constant reminder of a tragedy long buried. The new owners, Jack and Emily Miller, were a young couple fresh from the city, eager to leave behind the noise and chaos for a quieter life in the suburbs. Jack was a software engineer with a knack for fixing anything mechanical, while Emily, a former journalist, had taken a break from her career to focus on their new life together. They had fallen in love with the idea of renovating a classic home, pouring their hearts and savings into transforming the neglected property into their dream house. From their first walkthrough, the house had felt both charming and eerie. Emily had commented on the strange, heavy feeling in the basement, but Jack had brushed it off, saying it was probably just the musty air from years of disuse. They had grand plans, knocking down walls, adding a modern kitchen, and turning the gloomy basement into a bright, welcoming guest suite. As they settled in, they made a point to introduce themselves to the neighbors, bringing over freshly baked cookies and wine as housewarming gifts. When they knocked on the Thompsons' door, Lisa answered, her eyes shadowed and her smile strained. Emily noticed the slight tremor in Lisa's hands as she accepted the gift, her gaze lingering on the couple as if trying to place them. Over time, the Millers heard the whispers of Anna's story, the tragic tale of the missing girl that had once consumed the town. Emily, with her journalist's curiosity, couldn't help but dig deeper, piecing together the fragments of gossip and faded newspaper clippings she found online. She read about the fruitless searches, the dead-end leads, and the heart-wrenching interviews with Mark and Lisa. Though she tried to respect the Thompsons' privacy, Emily found herself glancing at their house often, wondering what kind of unimaginable pain lay behind those tightly drawn curtains. She began to feel a strange connection to the family, a gnawing urge to know more, to uncover the truth that had eluded the police for nearly a decade. Little did she know, the answers were closer than she could have ever imagined, hidden in the dark, crumbling corners of her own new home, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. As the weeks passed, Jack and Emily threw themselves into the renovation with enthusiasm, eager to breathe new life into their aging house. They stripped wallpaper, pulled up creaking floorboards, and knocked down old partitions, transforming the once gloomy space into something bright and modern. Yet, as they made their way to the basement, the air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, as if the house itself was hiding something. Jack was the first to notice the oddities. While tearing down a crumbling section of brick near the furnace, he found an unusually thick patch of wall. It was almost as if someone had reinforced it for a purpose other than structural support. He ran his hands over the cold bricks, noting how the mortar felt newer in some places, the color slightly different, a subtle, unsettling detail he couldn't quite ignore. "Hey, Em, come down here for a second," he called up the stairs. Emily, dust streaked across her face and paint flecks in her hair, clomped down the wooden steps, wiping her hands on her jeans. She squinted at the wall, brushing her fingers across the uneven surface. "That's strange. Why would someone patch this like that?" Jack grabbed a hammer, tapping lightly against the bricks. The sound was dull at first, but as he moved toward the center, the tone changed, a hollow, echoing thud. His heart quickened. He exchanged a glance with Emily, the unspoken question hanging between them. Without another word, Jack began chipping away at the mortar. Dust filled the air, settling on their clothes and clinging to the damp basement walls. As the first brick broke free, it clattered to the ground, revealing darkness beyond, a small, hidden space. He pried away another brick, then another, until a jagged hole gaped before them, large enough for them to peer inside. The light from Emily's phone cut through the shadows, revealing a cramped, narrow passage leading deeper into the foundation. The walls were rough, hastily carved, as if someone had dug the tunnel in a hurry. The air was cold, damp, and carried a faint, metallic scent that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. "Should we go in?" Emily whispered, her pulse pounding in her ears. Jack hesitated, the rational part of his mind screaming at him to stop, to seal the wall back up and forget what they had found. But his curiosity, that unrelenting itch to know, pushed him forward. He ducked into the dark passage, his broad shoulders scraping against the rough stone. The tunnel twisted sharply to the left, then opened into a small, low-ceilinged chamber. Emily's flashlight beam revealed a cot shoved against one wall, its thin mattress yellowed with age and stained with dark patches that sent a chill down her spine. Scattered across the floor were children's toys, a small, battered teddy bear missing one eye, a handful of crayon stubs, and a coloring book with pages torn and crumpled. But it was the walls that truly unsettled them. They were covered in frantic, childish scrawl, phrases scratched into the stone with whatever sharp object had been available. Some were simple, haunting words like, "Help me," and "I want to go home." Others were darker, more frantic, like, "Still here," and "Don't forget me." Emily stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. Jack felt the bile rise in his throat as he realized what this place had likely been. A prison, hidden beneath their feet all this time. "We need to call the police," he whispered, his voice tight with fear and disbelief. Right now. The police arrived within the hour, their dark blue uniforms a stark contrast against the dusty, crumbling basement walls. Officers swarmed the house, sealing off the entrance to the hidden room and setting up bright floodlights that cut through the gloom. Emily and Jack huddled on the front porch, arms wrapped around each other, their breaths coming in shaky bursts as they tried to process what they had just uncovered. Detective Sarah Monroe, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a hardened jaw, approached them. She had been on the force for over 20 years, but even she looked unsettled as she slipped off her gloves and flipped open her notebook. "Tell me exactly how you found this," she said, her pen poised, eyes locked on Jack. He recounted the events, from the first odd patch of brick to the moment they had stepped into the dark, forgotten space. As he spoke, he noticed the way Monroe's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had heard enough of these stories to recognize the signs. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a cell. Inside the basement, forensic technicians carefully bagged and tagged every piece of evidence. The toys, the bedding, the crayon stubs, and the crude, desperate messages scrawled into the stone. One officer held up a small, pink hair ribbon, its color faded but still painfully recognizable as something a young girl might wear. When one of the texts shone a UV light across the wall, new markings leaped into view, faint, smeared fingerprints and handprints, the desperate, ghostly echoes of someone who had once clawed at the stone, searching for freedom. As the officers continued their grim work, Monroe pulled Emily aside. "Did you ever hear anything? Any strange noises from the basement? Scratches, whispers, anything at all?" Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, nothing. It's been quiet. We just moved in a few weeks ago." Monroe's gaze flicked to the dark entrance of the tunnel. "Whoever built this didn't plan on being found. This isn't just a basement. It's a tomb." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She clutched Jack's hand, her mind racing with the horrifying implications. They had just stumbled onto a secret that would shake the entire town of Maplewood, a secret that had been buried in the dark, waiting for the light of day to reveal its terrible truth. The news of the hidden chamber beneath the Miller house spread through Maplewood like wildfire. Reporters swarmed the quiet street, their cameras flashing as they jostled for position outside the now infamous basement door. Neighbors whispered over fences, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. For the Thompsons, the discovery reopened old wounds, tearing away the fragile scar tissue that had formed over 9 years of heartbreak. Lisa heard about it first from a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who rushed over with a panicked look in her eyes. "Lisa," she stammered, clutching the edge of the doorframe. "They found something. In the Miller's basement. You should turn on the news." Lisa's heart raced as she fumbled for the remote, her fingers shaking. The TV crackled to life, the local news anchor's voice crackling through the speakers. "Breaking news in Maplewood, where a hidden room has been discovered beneath a suburban home. Authorities believe the small, concealed chamber may be connected to a years-old missing persons case. Forensic teams are currently on site, gathering evidence." Mark entered the living room, his face already drained of color. He didn't have to ask what was happening. The dread in Lisa's wide eyes told him enough. He sank into the couch beside her, reaching for her hand, his fingers cold and clammy. Images flashed on the screen. The miller's basement, floodlit and swarming with police, the crumbling bricks piled beside the jagged hole in the wall, and the grim, determined faces of the investigators. Lisa's heart felt like it was being crushed. Could this be it? Could this finally be the answer they had spent nearly a decade praying for? She squeezed Mark's hand tighter, her mind racing through 1,000 dark scenarios. Unable to sit still, Lisa grabbed her jacket and headed for the front door. Mark followed, his footsteps heavy on the worn wooden floors. They crossed the lawn in silence, the cool evening air sharp against their flushed skin. When they reached the miller's house, the scene was chaos, flashing red and blue lights, uniformed officers setting up barriers, and curious neighbors lining the sidewalk, their eyes wide with fear and fascination. Lisa pushed through the crowd, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. An officer stepped forward, blocking her path. "I'm sorry, ma'am, you can't be here. This is an active crime scene." She clutched his arm, her eyes wild. "Please, my daughter. Anna Thompson. She's been missing for 9 years. Is this about her?" The officer's face softened, his jaw tightening as he realized who she was. He guided her gently back toward the sidewalk, his voice low and steady. "I can't say for sure, ma'am, but the detectives are doing everything they can. You'll be informed as soon as we have any information." Mark wrapped his arms around Lisa, pulling her close as she sagged against him, her body shaking with silent, heart-wrenching sobs. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold, hard reality of the moment sinking in like a knife to the heart. As they turned to leave, Lisa glanced back at the darkened basement window, a flicker of movement catching her eye. For a brief, impossible moment, she thought she saw a small, shadowy figure peering out from the darkness, a face she had dreamed of for years. But when she blinked, the window was empty, the shadows still. The following days passed in a blur of police interviews, media chaos, and sleepless nights. The Thompsons found themselves thrust back into the spotlight, their grief dragged into the harsh glare of camera flashes and news headlines. Lisa felt as if she were reliving the worst days of her life, her mind trapped in an endless loop of fear and despair. Detective Monroe visited the Thompson house the next morning, her expression grave as she sat across from them in the dimly lit living room. She flipped open her notebook, the pages filled with hurried, cramped handwriting and hastily sketched diagrams. "We've recovered several items from the hidden room," Monroe began, her voice steady but laced with tension. "We found a small bed, children's toys, and several personal items that we believe belonged to a young girl." Lisa's breath hitched, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of the couch. Did you find anything with her name? Anything that proves it's Anna?" Monroe hesitated, her eyes flicking to Mark before settling back on Lisa. "We found a notebook. It's old and water-damaged, but some of the pages are still legible. We're having it analyzed now, but it appears to contain the name Anna written multiple times." Lisa felt the room tilt around her, the walls closing in as the air grew thick and heavy. Mark's arm tightened around her shoulders, his jaw clenched so hard it looked as if his teeth might crack. Is there any chance she's still alive?" he whispered, his voice raw and desperate. Monroe's expression softened, the hard lines of her face relaxing for a brief moment. "We're doing everything we can to find out. The tunnel was sealed off, but we're checking for any signs that someone might have used it recently. If Anna was down there, there's a chance she might have escaped." The faintest glimmer of hope flickered in Lisa's eyes, a spark she had almost forgotten she could feel. It was fragile, as thin as a thread, but it was enough to cling to in the darkness. As Monroe stood to leave, she placed a gentle hand on Lisa's shoulder. "I promise you, we're not giving up. We will find the truth, whatever it may be." After the detective left, Lisa sat in silence, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. She glanced at the family photo on the wall, Anna's bright, gap-toothed smile beaming back at her, and felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe, even just a little, that her daughter might still be out there, waiting to come home. Days turned into nights, and the once quiet town of Maplewood became a whirlwind of police activity. Officers scoured the Miller property, expanding their search beyond the hidden basement room to the surrounding yards and nearby wooded areas. The Thompsons watched from their front porch, their hearts heavy with a mixture of hope and fear, the flicker of police lights reflecting off their windows like ghostly whispers from the past. Detective Monroe remained a constant presence, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle in the trees, her instincts honed by years of chasing down ghosts. She had ordered ground-penetrating radar to be brought in, convinced that the secrets of the Miller house ran deeper than just a single hidden chamber. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and violet, Monroe received the first real breakthrough. One of the technicians, a lanky young man named Tyler, burst into the makeshift command center set up in the Miller's driveway, his face pale and his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Detective, you need to see this," he gasped, shoving a tablet into her hands. The screen displayed a 3D map of the Miller property, lines of blue and red crisscrossing in a chaotic tangle. But one section, just beyond the main house, glowed with a faint, pulsing green, an anomaly, a void in the otherwise solid ground. Monroe's heart raced as she studied the image. The chamber they had discovered was just the beginning. The tunnel extended further, snaking beneath the yard and into the dense woods beyond. She felt a surge of adrenaline, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She grabbed her radio, barking orders to her team. Within minutes, a line of officers, armed with flashlights and shovels, pushed their way through the thick underbrush at the edge of the Miller property. The air was cool and damp, the ground soft beneath their boots, the scent of pine and wet earth clinging to their clothes. Monroe led the charge, her flashlight cutting through the shadows as she followed the faint, flickering signal from Tyler's scanner. Branches clawed at her jacket, leaves rustled underfoot, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the trees, adding an eerie soundtrack to their desperate search. Finally, they reached the spot, a patch of disturbed earth hidden beneath a tangle of thorny bushes and fallen branches. Monroe dropped to her knees, brushing away the dirt with gloved hands, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the shouts of the officers behind her. As they dug, their shovels clinking against rocks and tangled roots, the ground suddenly gave way, crumbling into a hollow space below. Monroe's heart skipped a beat as the darkness yawned open before her, a gaping maw filled with shadows and whispered secrets. She leaned over the edge, her flashlight cutting through the gloom to reveal another narrow tunnel, its walls damp and covered in twisted roots that reached down like skeletal fingers. She felt a shiver run down her spine. "This isn't just a basement," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the sound of scraping metal and shifting earth. "This is a labyrinth." As the officers continued to clear the entrance, Monroe took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. She had chased monsters her entire career, hunted the shadows that lurked at the edges of society, but something about this place felt different, darker, more personal. She clicked on her radio, her voice sharp and steady. "All units, prepare to enter. We're going in." The air inside the tunnel was cold and damp, each breath tinged with the metallic taste of rust and decay. Monroe led the way, her flashlight slicing through the thick, oppressive darkness, casting long, twisted shadows against the jagged stone walls. The sound of her boots crunching against the gravel-strewn floor echoed back to her, a ghostly whisper that set her nerves on edge. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing at points until the officers had to stoop to avoid scraping their helmets against the low, crumbling ceiling. Water dripped from above, each splash echoing like a heartbeat, counting down the seconds as they moved deeper into the earth. Monroe's mind raced with possibilities. Who had built this place? And more importantly, why? Was this some kind of underground escape route, a secret hideaway, or something far darker? She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand, finding out if this labyrinth held the answers to Anna Thompson's 9-year-old mystery. As they rounded a sharp corner, the tunnel abruptly widened into a small, square chamber. The air was even colder here, thick and still, as if the very earth held its breath. Monroe's flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing cracked stone walls covered in a fine layer of dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room sat a small, rusted metal chair, its seat bent and twisted as if someone had tried to break free from its grasp. Scattered around the chair were fragments of rope, their frayed ends stained a dark, rust-colored brown that Monroe recognized all too well. She felt her stomach twist, her pulse racing as she stepped closer, her flashlight catching a glint of metal beneath the dirt. Bending down, she brushed away the dust, revealing a small, tarnished locket. Its heart-shaped pendant scratched and dented, the tiny clasp twisted and broken. Monroe's breath caught in her throat as she flipped it open, revealing a faded photograph inside. A young girl with bright, hopeful eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Anna Thompson. Monroe's hands shook as she carefully placed the locket into an evidence bag, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. If this was Anna's, then she had been here, alone and terrified, trapped in the dark with only her fears for company. Monroe stood, her jaw clenched, her eyes hard as she turned back to the tunnel. She wasn't just hunting shadows anymore. She was hunting a ghost. With a wave of her flashlight, she signaled for her team to follow, their footsteps echoing through the darkness as they pushed deeper into the unknown, each step bringing them closer to the truth, and perhaps the end of the nightmare that had haunted the Thompson family for nearly a decade. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, its twisted path snaking deeper into the earth. Monroe felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, each step a reminder of the countless nightmares she had chased over the years. The air grew colder, the walls slick with moisture, and the faint, metallic tang of rust filled her nose, clinging to the back of her throat like a bitter memory. The officers behind her moved cautiously, their flashlight beams dancing across the rough, uneven walls, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach out for them, whispering of forgotten secrets and buried fears. Monroe's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears as she tried to piece together the puzzle that had haunted the Thompson family for nearly a decade. As they rounded another sharp corner, the tunnel abruptly opened into a larger chamber, its walls lined with jagged, uneven stones that jutted out like broken teeth. The floor was littered with debris, crumpled papers, shattered glass, and rusted metal fragments, the remnants of a place long forgotten, yet still echoing with the ghostly whispers of those who had passed through it. Monroe's flashlight swept across the room, her eyes catching on a pile of faded, torn clothing tossed carelessly into one corner. She stepped closer, her heart sinking as she recognized the small, floral patterns and bright, pastel colors, the kind of clothes a young girl might wear. She knelt down, brushing her fingers over the thin, tattered fabric, her mind filled with images of Anna, scared and alone, clinging to the remnants of her childhood as the darkness closed in around her. Nearby, another officer, a burly man with a thick, graying beard, called out, "Detective, over here." Monroe rose quickly, her flashlight cutting through the shadows as she crossed the room to where he stood, his face pale and eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He pointed to the far wall, where a crude, makeshift bed had been constructed from a pile of dirty blankets and flattened cardboard boxes. Above the bed, scrawled in shaky, uneven handwriting, were dozens of names scratched into the stone, some crossed out, others circled, their letters jagged and desperate, as if carved with trembling hands. Monroe's heart caught in her throat as her eyes landed on one name in particular, etched deeper and more forcefully than the others, Anna Thompson. She felt a chill race down her spine, her hands trembling as she reached for her radio. "This is Detective Monroe. We found something, evidence that Anna Thompson was here. I need a full forensic team down here now." As she waited for the response, her eyes drifted back to the wall, her mind racing with the terrible implications. Had Anna been alone down here, carving her name into the cold, unfeeling stone as a final act of defiance, a desperate attempt to leave some trace of her existence behind? Or had someone else been with her, someone who had crossed out the other names, erasing their memories as if wiping away the last traces of their lives? Monroe felt a surge of determination, her jaw clenching as she straightened, her flashlight beams slicing through the darkness like a blade. She had come too far to turn back now. She would find the truth, no matter how deep it was buried, no matter how dark the shadows became. As the forensic team arrived, the tunnel echoed with the sounds of rustling paper and snapping gloves, the once still darkness now alive with the frantic energy of discovery. Monroe stood back, her sharp eyes never leaving the scrawled names on the wall, her mind spinning with questions, her heart pounding with the urgency of a race against time. One of the technicians, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a steady hand, carefully dusted the stone wall for fingerprints, her movements precise and deliberate. She paused, leaning closer to the wall, her flashlight catching on a small, rectangular object wedged between two loose stones. "Detective," she called out, her voice tight with anticipation. "You might want to see this." Monroe crossed the room in a few quick strides, her boots crunching against the debris-strewn floor as she crouched beside the technician. The young woman carefully pried the object free, revealing a small, battered diary, its leather cover cracked and stained, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. Monroe's heart raced as she took the diary, her gloved fingers trembling as she flipped it open, the faint, looping handwriting barely legible in the dim light. The first page was dated nearly 9 years ago, the year Anna had disappeared. The entries were short, frantic, each one a desperate plea for help, a whispered cry from the darkness. "August 12th, they took me. I don't know where I am. It's dark. I'm scared. I want my mom. September 3rd, I hear voices sometimes. They whisper my name. I'm not alone. I have to be brave. October 17th, I miss my family. I miss the sun. I don't want to be forgotten." Monroe felt a tightness in her chest as she read the final, heart-wrenching entry, the letters scratched into the page with such force that the paper had nearly torn. "December 21st, if anyone finds this, please tell my mom I never gave up. I never stopped hoping. I never stopped fighting." Monroe closed the diary, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as the weight of Anna's words settled over her like a cold, suffocating blanket. She had to find her, had to bring her home, had to end this nightmare once and for all. As she rose to her feet, her flashlight cutting through the shadows, she felt the whispers of the past swirl around her, their voices growing louder, more insistent, pushing her forward into the darkness that lay ahead. The discovery of Anna's diary sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Detective Monroe felt a renewed sense of urgency, the thin, brittle pages of the journal echoing with a young girl's desperate fight to survive. She clutched the diary tightly as she pushed deeper into the tunnel, her flashlight casting long, trembling shadows against the damp, uneven walls. The air grew colder as they moved further underground, the distant echoes of dripping water and scurrying rodents creating an eerie, almost rhythmic soundtrack to their descent. The tunnel twisted and turned, its walls narrowing and then widening unexpectedly, like the winding coils of some ancient, slumbering beast. Monroe felt the weight of the earth pressing down on her, the darkness clinging to her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. They reached another fork in the path, the jagged stone walls splitting into two narrow corridors, each stretching off into the darkness like the gaping jaws of a hungry predator. Monroe paused, shining her flashlight down each passage, the beams revealing only more shadow and stone. She took a deep breath, her pulse racing as she weighed the risks. "Split up," she ordered, her voice sharp and clear. "Teams of 2. Stay in radio contact at all times. If you find anything, and I mean anything, you call it in immediately." The officers nodded, their faces pale and tense as they broke into pairs, their footsteps echoing against the cold stone as they disappeared into the darkness. Monroe chose the left path, the narrow tunnel pressing in on her as she moved forward, the jagged rocks scraping against her sleeves, the air growing colder with each step. She passed more crude carvings, the names etched into the walls growing more frantic, their letters jagged and uneven, as if the hands that had carved them had been trembling with fear and desperation. She felt a shiver crawl down her spine as she passed a particularly deep gouge, the letters barely legible through the thick layer of dust and grime. "Help me." Her flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out as the darkness seemed to press closer, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive. Monroe's breath quickened, her mind racing with thoughts of Anna, trapped in this suffocating darkness, her only companions the echoes of her own terrified whispers. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, the loose stones crumbling under her boots as she stumbled forward, her flashlight clattering against the wall as she reached out to steady herself. She caught herself just in time, her heart pounding as she realized she was standing on the edge of a deep, narrow pit, the darkness below yawning open like the jaws of a hungry beast. She shone her flashlight down into the abyss, the beam revealing a rusted metal ladder bolted to the wall, its rungs coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Monroe felt her pulse quicken, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she realized that this was no ordinary tunnel. It was a labyrinth, a twisted maze of stone and shadow that had swallowed Anna whole. She gripped the cold, rusted metal, her hands trembling as she lowered herself onto the ladder, the rungs creaking and groaning under her weight. She felt the cool, damp air rising from the depths below, the scent of wet stone and stale, forgotten air filling her lungs as she descended into the darkness, her flashlight flickering weakly in her other hand. As she reached the bottom, her boots sinking into the soft, muddy ground, she felt the walls close in around her, the darkness growing thicker and more suffocating, the air heavy with the whispers of the past. She straightened, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps as she shone her flashlight around the small, claustrophobic chamber, the jagged stone walls streaked with rust and mold, the floor littered with the crumbling remains of forgotten lives. And there, in the far corner, half buried in the thick, wet mud, lay a small, battered shoe, its faded pink fabric caked with dirt and grime, its laces frayed and knotted in a tight, desperate tangle. Monroe felt her heart clench, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she reached down to pick it up. The shoe was small, too small, and she knew, without a doubt, that it belonged to Anna Thompson. Monroe's fingers trembled as she cradled the tiny, mud-streaked shoe in her hands, her mind reeling with 1,000 unanswered questions. She felt the cold, wet fabric press against her gloves, the weight of the shoe a grim reminder of the young life it had once carried, the bright, hopeful footsteps it had once marked. She placed the shoe carefully into an evidence bag, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps as she straightened, her flashlight casting long, trembling shadows against the jagged stone walls. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain focused, to push past the fear and uncertainty that threatened to consume her. As she stepped deeper into the small, suffocating chamber, her flashlight caught on something metallic, half buried in the mud near the far wall. She crouched down, brushing away the thick, wet earth to reveal a small, rusted metal box, its lid twisted and dented, the hinges barely holding together. She pried the box open, the rusted metal screeching in protest as the lid finally gave way, revealing a collection of small, battered objects, a cracked plastic hairbrush, a broken, faded pink hair clip, and a handful of crumpled, water-stained notes, their edges torn and frayed. Monroe carefully unfolded one of the notes, her heart pounding as she recognized the small, looping handwriting, Anna's handwriting. The words were faint, the ink smeared and blurred by years of damp, but the message was clear. "I'm still here. Please don't forget me." Monroe felt a cold, suffocating weight settle over her, the darkness pressing in on her like a shroud, the whispers of the past echoing in her ears, their voices growing louder and more desperate with each passing moment. She slipped the notes carefully into the evidence bag, her mind racing with thoughts of Anna, trapped in this terrible, forgotten place, her only hope the faint, flickering memory of a family that had never stopped searching for her. She straightened, her jaw clenched, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as she turned back to the tunnel. She wasn't just chasing shadows anymore. She was hunting the truth, no matter how deep it was buried, no matter how dark the path became. Monroe's breath came in short, ragged bursts as she pushed deeper into the tunnel, the cold, damp air clinging to her skin like a shroud. Her flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly as if the darkness itself was trying to swallow the light. She tightened her grip on the small metal box, its rusted edges cutting into her gloves as she stumbled over the uneven ground, her boots crunching against the scattered debris of forgotten lives. The narrow passage twisted and turned, the walls closing in around her, the ceiling so low in places that she had to stoop to avoid scraping her helmet against the jagged stone. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, each step a struggle against the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She felt the whispers of the past brush against her ears, the echoes of forgotten voices clawing at her mind, their desperate pleas growing louder with each passing moment. As she rounded another corner, the tunnel abruptly widened into a larger chamber, its walls covered in thick, tangled roots that reached down from the ceiling like the gnarled fingers of some ancient, slumbering beast. The air here was even colder, the faint, metallic tang of rust and decay filling her nostrils, clinging to the back of her throat like a bitter, metallic taste. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing a series of small, rusted metal cages stacked against one wall, their bars twisted and bent, the metal stained with a dark, rust-colored residue that sent a chill racing down her spine. She felt her heart clench as she realized what she was looking at, a makeshift prison hidden deep beneath the earth, its forgotten inhabitants long since abandoned to the darkness. Monroe stepped closer, her pulse pounding in her ears as she reached for one of the cages, her fingers trembling as she brushed the cold, rusted metal. She felt a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, the metal thrumming beneath her touch as if echoing with the long-forgotten screams of those who had once been trapped within. She shone her flashlight into the nearest cage, her breath catching in her throat as the beam revealed a small, crumpled shape huddled in the far corner, a bundle of rags and matted hair, its thin, skeletal limbs twisted and contorted, its head bowed as if in prayer. Monroe felt her stomach twist, her heart racing as she realized that the figure was too small, too fragile, too human to be a simple pile of debris. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch the cold, rusted bars, her mind racing with the terrible implications. "Anna," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. The figure stirred, its thin, skeletal arms twitching weakly as its head slowly lifted, the matted hair falling away to reveal a pair of hollow, sunken eyes, their once bright light dimmed to a faint, flickering ember. The figure's cracked, parched lips parted, a faint, raspy whisper escaping its throat like the ghost of a long-forgotten scream. "Help me." Monroe felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the darkness closing in around her as the full, terrible weight of the truth crashed down upon her like a tidal wave. She had found Anna, not a ghost, not a memory, but the real, living, breathing girl who had been trapped in this suffocating darkness for nearly a decade, her spirit unbroken, her hope unshattered. Monroe dropped to her knees, her flashlight clattering to the ground as she reached for the cage, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the rusted lock, her mind racing with 1,000 desperate thoughts. She had found her. She had finally found her. And she would not leave her here, not for another second, not for another heartbeat. The cage door creaked open with a slow, rusty groan, the sound echoing through the chamber like the cry of a wounded animal. Monroe reached inside, her gloved hands trembling as she gently grasped Anna's thin, bony arms, her fingers brushing against the cold, clammy skin that clung to the girl's fragile bones like a shroud. Anna's eyes flickered, her cracked, parched lips parting in a weak, gasping breath as she struggled to focus, her head lolling weakly against Monroe's chest as the detective carefully lifted her from the cage. Monroe felt the girl's brittle, bird-like bones shift beneath her touch, her heart clenching with a mixture of relief and horror as she realized just how close Anna had come to fading into the darkness forever. "Hold on, Anna," Monroe whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she cradled the girl against her chest, her flashlight beam casting long, twisted shadows against the damp, uneven walls. "I've got you. You're safe now. I'm not leaving you." She staggered to her feet, her boots slipping on the wet, muddy ground as she struggled to support Anna's weight, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she pushed her way back toward the tunnel entrance, the darkness pressing in around her like a living, suffocating thing. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each step a struggle against the rising tide of fear and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. She felt the cold, damp air cling to her skin like a shroud, the whispers of the past echoing in her ears, their voices growing louder and more desperate with each passing moment. As she stumbled into the main tunnel, The distant beams of flashlight beams danced against the walls, the muffled voices of her fellow officers echoing through the darkness like the faint, flickering memories of a long-forgotten dream. "Over here," Monroe shouted, her voice raw and ragged as she pushed her way through the darkness, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief as the distant figures turned toward her, their flashlight beams cutting through the shadows like blades of light. The officers rushed forward, their hands reaching out to support her as she collapsed to her knees, her arms still wrapped tightly around Anna's fragile, trembling body. She felt the girl's thin, skeletal limbs twitch weakly against her chest, her faint, gasping breaths a harsh, rattling whisper against her ear. "We've got you, Anna," Monroe whispered, her tears mixing with the mud and grime that clung to her face as she tightened her grip on the girl, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love that she had never known before. "We've got you. You're safe now." And as the officers gently lifted Anna from her arms, their voices rising in a chorus of shouts and orders as they rushed her toward the distant, faintly glowing exit, Monroe felt the darkness around her finally begin to recede, the shadows pulling back as the first, faint rays of light broke through the gloom, chasing away the whispers of the past and lighting the way toward a brighter, more hopeful future. As Anna was finally lifted from the shadows and back into the light, the years of pain, fear, and uncertainty began to dissolve, replaced by hope and healing. Her rescue was more than just the end of a nightmare. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, the unbreakable bonds of family, and the courage of those who refuse to give up on the lost and forgotten. This story reminds us all that even in the darkest places, a flicker of light can guide us home. Anna's journey from the depths of despair to the promise of a new beginning is a powerful reminder that hope can survive even the longest shadows. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional and gripping journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more compelling stories like this. Your support means the world and helps us bring more stories that touch hearts and open minds. Until next time, stay safe, stay hopeful, and remember, every light shines brightest after the darkest night.